November 26th, 1943. A makeshift prisoner enclosure on the coral-dusted ruins of Betio Island, Tarawa Atoll. The Americans expected their captives to fear death. They did not. They expected them to fear torture. They did not. The one thing they truly feared, the one thing they refused with a terrifying, silent resolve, was a can of American peaches. They were the ghosts of the Sasebo 7th Special Naval Landing Force, the elite Rikusentai who had sworn to defend the island to the last man. For 3 brutal days they had fought. For 3 days they had followed the Imperial Rescript, embracing a code that offered only 2 paths: victory or a glorious death, a gyokusai. Surrender was not a word in their vocabulary. It was a spiritual stain, a betrayal so profound it erased one's existence. Now they sat in the suffocating humidity, their gazes fixed on a middle distance that held nothing but shimmering heat and the ghosts of their comrades. Their stillness was a weapon in itself. It unnerved the young Marines assigned to guard them, boys from Ohio and Texas who had been trained to kill an enemy, not to comprehend him. 20-year-old Corporal Gene Davis, a farm boy from outside Dayton, had never seen anything like it. Not the burning rage he had expected, not the animal fear he had seen in his own friend's eyes, just nothing. A void. An emptiness that seemed to swallow the very light of the equatorial sun. The Americans brought food. Tins of corned beef hash, salty crackers, Army-issue fruit cocktails swimming in thick syrup. They left the sea rations in neat stacks at the edge of the hastily constructed wire enclosure. It was a gesture of protocol, mandated by a Geneva Convention that felt a million miles away. Maybe it was a gesture of something else, too. Pity? Curiosity? Nobody knew. The prisoners stared past the offerings as if they were nothing more than coral stones. They turned their backs. Low whispers, sharp and venomous, passed between them. Daku. Poison. The American devils, the Kachiku Baihai, were trying to poison them. It was a trick, a final, unspeakable humiliation before the inevitable execution. Someone said the cans were filled with the flesh of swine, a calculated defilement meant to corrupt their Japanese spirit, their Yamato Damashi. The rumor spread like a fever through the silent, huddled ranks. Seaman First Class Kenji Tanaka, barely 18 and with the ghost of his mother's cooking still a faint memory, felt his stomach clench into a painful, hollow knot. Days of nothing but brackish salt water and the metallic taste of adrenaline. His training officer's voice, a constant, barking presence from the parade grounds in Yokosuka, echoed in the chambers of his mind. "The enemy is a beast," the officer had screamed, his face inches from Tanaka's. "His kindness is a carefully crafted lie. His food is a weapon meant to rot your soul from within. To accept it is to accept defeat. To accept it is to betray the emperor." So Tanaka looked away. They all looked away. They refused the cans. They refused the water. They refused the life they were being offered. The official report, filed under the prosaic title POW Sustenance Intake Report, Tarawa, 28 November 1943, landed on the desk of a Navy intelligence officer in Pearl Harbor, a man named Lieutenant Commander Miller. The document was dry, clinical, typed on flimsy paper. It noted a 98% refusal rate for all standard ration types among the 147 captured Japanese and Korean personnel. A stark footnote mentioned that advanced dehydration and malnutrition were becoming critical. Another day, maybe 2, and the problem would solve itself in the grimmest way imaginable. The official recommendation was forced hydration and intravenous feeding, a logistical nightmare. But then came the addendum, a handwritten scrawl in the margin, dated November 29th, from a G2 intelligence liaison on the island. Anomaly observed. Prisoner compliance shift noted. See attached field note G2T4. The field note was from Corporal Davis. It was not clinical. It was written in pencil on the back of a supply requisition form. the words smudged with sweat and dirt. It described a moment of pure chance, a moment born of boredom and a strange, inexplicable empathy. Davis, sitting on an ammunition crate and eating his own ration, had a Hershey's milk chocolate bar. Not the standard issue D ration, the hard, bitter block of survival chocolate engineered to taste just bad enough that GIs wouldn't eat it for pleasure. This was a real one, a prize from a care package sent from home. On an impulse he would never be able to fully explain, he broke off a small piece. He lobbed it underhand, a gentle arc, through the wire. It landed in the sand, not near any one prisoner, but in the no-man's land between the captors and the captured. For a full hour, the small, dark rectangle sat there, slowly losing its form in the oppressive heat, a tiny monument to a distant world of sweetness and comfort. The prisoners ignored it, their discipline a fortress. But the fortress had a crack. A young Korean laborer conscripted into the Japanese war effort and with less to prove, began to crawl toward it. His movements were furtive, pathetic, the desperate motion of a starving animal. He snatched it, shoved it into his mouth. The guards tensed, waiting. A convulsion? A cry of agony from the poison? There was nothing. Only a look of profound, bewildered shock on the man's dirt-caked face. His eyes widened. He chewed slowly as if trying to solve a puzzle with his tongue. Then another prisoner moved, and another. Not for the beef, not for the peaches, for the chocolate. What was this dark magic? What was this substance that could bypass the will of the emperor? Miller read the note twice, then a third time. It made no military sense. These were men who had charged into machine gun fire with bayonets. Men who held grenades to their own chests. They had been trained for death. They had been trained for torture. They had not, it seemed, been trained for Hershey's. The folder was eventually closed, the incident on Tarawa a minor curiosity, a bizarre footnote in the vast bloody ledger of the Pacific War. The official explanation was simple, biological. The prisoners were starving, and the intense caloric density of the chocolate, the pure rush of fat and sugar, finally overwhelmed their indoctrinated discipline. A switch in the primitive brain. Case closed. But the stories that persisted among the Marines who were there were different. They weren't about calories. They were about memory and the lack of it. For men raised on a spare diet of rice, pickled vegetables, and nationalist fervor, the sudden, intense sweetness was an experience from another reality. It was a flavor of the world they had been told was decadent, weak, and barbaric. Yet here it was, a small moment of undeniable, uncomplicated pleasure. It was not poison. It was not a trick. It was just good. And that simple, profound goodness did more to dismantle the myth of the demonic American enemy than 1,000 propaganda leaflets ever could. It planted a question more dangerous than any bomb. If the enemy lied about something so small, so simple, so sweet, what else did they lie about? This investigation goes beyond the battle reports and into the scattered, fading memories of the few who survived both the battle and the peace that followed. It uncovers the hidden story of how a simple taste of chocolate became the first unexpected crack in the psychological armor of Imperial Japan. December 8, 1941. A map room in Pearl Harbor. The air still smelled of oil of ruin. Smoke smudged the otherwise perfect blue sky over Oahu. But inside, under the hum of electric fans, the war had already moved on. It had moved onto the maps, vast blue maps of the Pacific Ocean. An ocean suddenly hostile. An ocean suddenly belonging to someone else. An officer, a captain named Rawlins, pointed a wooden dowel at a scatter of tiny dots. Almost invisible. South of the Marshalls, west of the line, the Gilbert Islands. Specks of dust. Coral dust in the middle of nowhere. Before yesterday, they were a footnote in a geography book. A British protectorate. A place for coconuts and not much else. Now they were a problem. A very big problem. They were a string of unsinkable aircraft carriers, a fence, a barrier cutting the sea lanes between Hawaii and Australia. a dagger pointed at the heart of the American fleet. What was left of it? 2 days later, the Japanese arrived. Not with a fleet, not with an armada. Just a few ships slipping through the dawn haze on December 10th. The 51st Guard Force? Special Naval Landing Forces, SNLF. It sounded so sterile. So professional. They landed on Tarawa Atoll and on Makin. The handful of British coast watchers and missionaries could do nothing. They sent a final radio message. Then, silence. The Gilberts were gone, swallowed by the empire of the sun. For almost 2 years, the silence held. Rumors trickled out. Whispers from submarines on patrol, a daring raid by Carlson's Marine Raiders on Macon in August 1942. A pinprick, a gesture. It rattled the Japanese. It made them notice. It made them build. That's how it began. The file was designated galvanic, a bland technical name for a bloody piece of business. Inside were the sketches, reconnaissance photos taken by high-flying B-24s, artistic renderings drawn from interviews with a handful who had escaped. The sketches showed Betio, a tiny bird-shaped island at the corner of Tarawa Atoll. 1 square mile. 1 square mile of sand and coral, and steel and concrete. The intelligence officers stared at the drawings. They saw the coconut log walls 10 feet thick filled with sand. They saw the interlocking fields of fire from hundreds of pillboxes. They saw the machine gun nests, the rifle pits, the anti-boat guns salvaged from British and Japanese ships. They saw the command bunker reinforced with concrete and railroad iron, a fortress, the most concentrated defensive network in the Pacific, maybe in the world. The man who built it was Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki, a naval engineer, 49 years old. He was a professional, he was methodical, and he was a believer. He told his men a simple thing, a promise. It would take 1,000,000 men 100 years to conquer Tarawa. 1,000,000 men, 100 years. The American planners read the quote in their intelligence summaries. Some of them laughed. They had 3 days. They had the 2nd Marine Division. They had battleships, carriers, destroyers. They had everything they did not understand. They did not understand Shibasaki or his men. The Japanese defenders were not just soldiers, they were a cult of death. Their Bible was a small red book, the Senjin Connect the Field Service Code. Issued in 1941 by Hideki Tojo himself, its words were absolute, its logic was iron. A soldier shall not be taken alive. A soldier shall not surrender. To be captured was a stain, a shame that would follow your family for generations, your mother, your father, your wife, your child, all stained by your cowardice. All of them. Death was not failure. Death in battle was the ultimate fulfillment of duty. It was called Gyokusai, the shattered jewel. Better to be a beautiful gem smashed to pieces than a whole tile, intact but common. They were told the Americans were not human. The propaganda posters showed them as devils, demons with long noses and red hair. Kichiku Baihai, the fiendish American and British soldiers. The leaflets dropped on them said they would be tortured, that their bodies would be desecrated, that their testicles would be cut off and stuffed in their mouths. That was a rumor, a persistent rumor. Maybe it came from command. Maybe it grew on its own in the hot, paranoid air of the bunkers. It didn't matter. They believed it. They believed it to their very souls. So when the time came, they would fight. To the last bullet. And then with the bayonet. And then with their hands, their teeth. And then with the final grenade, the one held against the stomach. Macon was first. November 20th, 1943. The U.S. Army's 27th Infantry Division went ashore. It was supposed to be easy. Easier than Tarawa, but it wasn't easy. The defenders, 600 of them, fought from pits and trenches. They launched suicidal banzai charges at night. Screaming, always screaming. When it was over, only one Japanese combatant was captured. One. The commander, a man named Seiso Ishikawa, performed seppuku with his sword. He shattered his own jewel. But Tarawa was different. Beitio was waiting. Shibasaki was waiting. With him were nearly 5,000 men. The 3rd Special Base Force, the 7th Sasebo Special Naval Landing Force, the 111th Construction Unit. Engineers, laborers, pioneers, soldiers, Imperial Marines, all of them believers. They had chanted the creed. They had read the Little Red Book. They had cleaned their rifles. They had sighted their mortars. They knew the Americans were coming. They could smell them on the salt wind. The intelligence reports in the American flagship were thick. Folders stamped secret. They had photos, maps, tie charts. They had the order of battle. They believed they knew everything. The number of guns, the thickness of the walls, the location of the command post. They knew the what, the where, the how. They did not know the why. Not really. Not yet. The tide was coming in. And with it, hell. October 12th, 1943. An unmarked office in the Ichigaya district of Tokyo. The air smelled of charcoal ink and cheap paper. 24-year-old artist Hideo Watanabe held a brush, its tip fine as a needle. He was a graduate of the Tokyo University of the Arts. He had once painted serene landscapes. Mount Fuji in the morning mist, cherry blossoms over a quiet pond. Now he painted monsters. His subject was an American soldier, but it was not a man. It was an oni, a demon. The instructions were very specific. The jaw must be wide, ape-like. The eyes, small and cruel, set close together under a sloping brow. Body hair thick and matted like an animal's pelt. In one hand, the demon held a bayonet. Its tip dripped with blood. In the other, it clutched the severed head of a Japanese woman. The folder on his desk was thin, bound in plain brown cardboard. It was called Instruction Number 7, Depiction of the Enemy. It came from a bureau with no name. Maybe the information board, maybe Army General Staff. Nobody asked, you just did the work. This wasn't about truth. This was about something more important. Survival. The Americans were coming. They were a tide of steel and machines. How do you fight a machine? You don't. You fight the man inside. You make him something less than a man. Something you can hate. Something you must kill before it kills you. Hideo dipped his brush again. He added a gold tooth, glinting from the demon's sneering mouth. A detail from another memo. They steal gold teeth from the dead. And the living. That's how it all began. The whispers started in the training camps. In Chiba, in Kagoshima, in Hokkaido. Young recruits, boys from farms and fishing villages heard the stories. They heard them from grizzled sergeants, men with scars and a 1,000-yard stare. Men like Sergeant Major Kenjiro Ito. Ito had been in China. He had seen things, or so he said. "Do not let them take you," he would rasp, his voice like grinding stones. "Do not even think of it." He would pause. Let the silence hang in the dusty barracks air. The Americans are not like us. They have no honor, no soul. They are Kichiku Beihai, brutal, demonic American soldiers. The phrase was repeated in lectures, in manuals, on posters. Kichiku Beihei. Ito told them what would happen. He described it in flat, emotionless detail, how they would be tied down, how their fingernails would be pulled out with pliers, one by one, how they would use bayonets for sport, to see who could make a man scream the longest. He spoke of medical experiments, of vivisection on conscious prisoners, of bodies dumped in mass graves and covered with lime. He spoke of desecration, of bodies used for target practice, of heads boiled to make skulls for souvenirs. Nobody questioned. Sergeant Major Ito was a veteran. He knew. The stories spread like a fever. They were in the letters home, the ones that passed the censors. They were in the smuggled newspapers from neutral territories, heavily edited and annotated. They were in the radio dramas that played every night. The heroic Japanese soldier cornered and wounded, choosing a grenade over the clutches of the drooling, savage American? It was a narrative, a powerful, intoxicating narrative. Death before dishonor. But it was more than that now. It was death before torture, death before unimaginable violation. The official field service code, the Senjin Kunjirantiiri, was explicit. Do not live to experience the shame of capture. But the code was abstract, an officer's ideal. The stories from Sergeant Major Ito, the drawings from Hideo Watanabe's office. That was real. It was visceral. It gave the code a terrifying logic. You didn't just die for the Emperor. You died to escape the demon. It was a perfect trap. They spoke of Atu, the island in the Aleutians, lost in May. Every man there had become a god, a hero. The propaganda called it Gyokusai, a glorious annihilation, like shattered jade. 2,650 men. That's how many fought. 2,650. The report said only 28 were captured, most of them unconscious, wounded, unable to take their own lives. 28 out of more than 2,000. Why? The answer was in the thin brown folder on Hideo's desk. It was in the gravelly voice of Sergeant Major Ito. The garrison on Atu had been told the Americans would castrate any prisoners, that they would run over the wounded with their tanks. The last desperate Banzai charge on May 29th was not an attack. It was a mass suicide fueled by terror. They ran towards the American lines hoping to die. Anything was better than capture. Anything. And then the main thing started. The islands. Tarawa, Makin, Kwajalein, and Iwetok. One by one, the coral atolls became furnaces. The Americans came ashore expecting soldiers who would surrender when a battle was lost. They found something else entirely. They found men who seemed to prefer death. Men who would hide in a pillbox with a shattered leg and wait, just to take one more American with them. Men who would hold a grenade to their own chest when cornered. Men who would charge into machine gun fire with nothing but a sword. The Americans called it fanaticism. They called it insane. They didn't understand. They couldn't see the images burned into the minds of the Japanese soldiers. The drawings, the stories. Hideo Watanabe's ink-black monsters. Corporal Susumu Tanaka of the 3rd Yokosuka Special Naval Landing Force lay in a shell crater on Saipan. It was July 1944. His leg was a ruin of blood and bone. His rifle was gone. He had one possession left, a Type 99 grenade. He could hear them. The Americans. Their voices were close. Guttural, alien sounds. He remembered the poster he had seen in the barracks. The ape-like face. The bloody bayonet. The words of his commander, Lieutenant Hayashi, before the landing. They will show you no mercy. They will desecrate your spirit. Your only path is to die with honor, taking one of them with you. To become a guardian spirit of the nation. A voice called out in broken Japanese. Mizu. Water? It was a trick. It had to be a trick. The demons were clever. They would lure you out. Then the pliers, the bayonets, the laughter. The pin of the grenade was cold against his thumb. The American voices were closer now. He could hear the crunch of their boots on the coral rock. He closed his eyes. The drawing from Tokyo was all he could see. The demon's face. And he knew what he had to do. May 16th, 1944. Hancock County, Iowa. He was certain it was his last meal. Sergeant Kenji Tanaka, 23 years old, formerly of the Imperial Japanese Navy, watched the American guard place the metal tray on the table. The tray was heavy. Everything in America was heavy. The trucks, the guards, the silence. Now the food. It was not the smell of the transport ship, a stench of diesel, sweat, and vomit. It was not the smell of the island, of rotting coconuts and death. This was a new smell, a smell of a kitchen, a real kitchen. Tanaka stared. The men around him stared. Ito, Mori, Yamaguchi, men who had survived the siege of Kwajalein, men who had chewed leather to stay alive. They were now defeated by a metal tray. On it, things he could barely name. Two thick slices of impossibly white bread. A perfect yellow square of what they called butter. A slab of dark, roasted meat resting in a pool of its own juices. A mountain of creamy mashed potatoes, white as snow. A pile of bright green beans, glistening. And a mug. A heavy ceramic mug filled with a steaming black liquid. Coffee. Beside it, two small paper-wrapped cubes. Sugar. Two of them. Nobody moved, the whispers began. A single word passed from man to man like a secret prayer. Doku. Poison. It had to be poison. It was the only explanation. The radio from Tokyo had warned them. The training officers had drilled it into their skulls. The Americans were devious, barbaric. They would not give a feast to their enemies. This was a trick, a final, cruel, humiliating execution. This had to be the end. Tanaka looked at the face of Ensign Ito, a man who had once charged a machine gun nest with only a sword. Ito's hands were trembling. This was a new kind of fear. Not the hot fear of battle, this was a cold fear, a fear of the absurd. An American guard approached. He was a boy. 19, maybe 20. His face was a constellation of freckles. His uniform seemed too big for him. Corporal John Miller from a farm 30 miles down the road. They did not know his name. They only saw the enemy. The executioner. Miller saw the untouched trays. He saw the frozen, mask-like faces. He frowned, a look of simple confusion. He didn't understand Bushido. He understood hunger. He mumbled something in his alien tongue, gesturing toward the food. Eat. The silence was absolute. The corporal sighed, a theatrical farm boy sigh. He walked to Tanaka's tray. He picked up the fork, a strange three-pronged tool. He speared a piece of the meat. He stabbed a single green bean. He put them in his mouth. He chewed, his jaw working slowly. He swallowed. Then he smiled. A wide, guileless smile. He patted his full stomach and pointed at the tray again. Good, he grunted. Good food. He was not dead. He was not writhing on the floor. He was smiling. That's how it began. One by one, like men defusing a bomb, they picked up their forks. Tanaka copied the guard's movements. He cut a tiny piece of meat. He lifted it to his lips. He waited. Nothing. He put it in his mouth. It was an explosion. Salt, fat, iron, herbs, a universe of flavor in a single bite. He ate a green bean. It snapped. It was not boiled to mush, not pickled in salt for a long voyage. It was fresh, crisp. The potatoes were a warm, buttery cloud. The bread, slathered with the melting yellow butter, was a luxury beyond a civilian's dream in wartime Tokyo. And the coffee, sweetened with 2 whole cubes of sugar, it was a black, hot miracle. It was not a last meal. It was a first meal. The first meal of a new, terrifying reality. A folder in a Washington, D.C. office, miles and an ocean away, was labeled POW Sustenance Program, Pacific Theater. The reports inside were clean, clinical, typed. They spoke of caloric minimums, vitamin C, protein, supply chains. Costs were calculated to the 3rd decimal point. The documents detailed a logistical success, a triumph of American planning. The documents missed the point entirely. This was not logistics. This was warfare. A Japanese soldier's ration was a science of minimalism. 1 ball of rice, maybe 2, a sliver of pickled radish, a strip of dried fish if the supply lines held. Water. It was fuel to make the body march. It was fuel to make the body die. Nothing more. A prisoner's ration at Camp Hancock, Iowa. Breakfast, scrambled eggs, bacon, toast, jam, coffee. Lunch, a sandwich with thick slices of meat and cheese, an apple, a glass of milk. Milk, a drink for infants now given to grown men. Dinner, roast beef, potatoes, vegetables, bread, butter, and, on Tuesdays, a slice of pie. Pie. They had to ask the Nisei interpreter what it was. The change was physical. The hollows in their cheeks vanished. The sallow, jaundiced tint of their skin was replaced by a healthy color. Wounds healed faster. They were gaining weight. They were becoming healthy. And they were becoming lost. The propaganda was a lie. The Kachikube the Anglo-American devils, did not exist. Devils did not worry if your coffee was hot. Demons did not offer you a second slice of bread. The entire foundation of their world, the righteous struggle against a brutal enemy, was cracking. It was breaking apart, not under interrogation, but under the weight of mashed potatoes. The rumors in the barracks changed. Before they whispered of torture, of medical experiments, of summary executions. Now they whispered of food. Someone said the men at Camp McCoy in Wisconsin got ice cream. Ice cream. Another heard of a strange, shimmering food that jiggled on the plate. Jell-O. Tanaka lay on his cot. His stomach was full. A strange, forgotten sensation. He was not happy. He was not grateful. He was terrified. The emperor, the empire, the honor of his ancestors, the sacred duty to die. It all felt like a story told to children, a thin paper screen, and he had now seen what was behind it. An endless, impossible, soul-crushing supply of roast beef and apple pie. The physical war was over for them. And then the main thing started. May 16th, 1944, Hancock County, Iowa. He was certain it was his last meal. Sergeant Kenji Tanaka, 23 years old, formerly of the Imperial Japanese Navy, watched the American guard place the metal tray before him. He did not look at the guard's face. He looked at the food. Not the meager ball of rice and pickled radish of the Imperial fleet. Not the watery soup of the Tarawa stockade. This was something else entirely. White bread, impossibly soft. A slab of yellow butter melting into its pores. Slices of roasted meat, thick and glistening. Potatoes, green beans. A glass of milk, cold and white. A feast for a condemned man. He had been taught the Americans were barbarians. They would torture him for information, then execute him. This generosity was a form of torture, a psychological trick before the end, and then he saw it, resting on a small paper napkin, a dark brown rectangle wrapped in silver foil and a paper sleeve. The guard, a young man with a farm boy face named Miller, maybe Muller, pointed at it. Hershey's, he said. The word meant nothing to Tanaka. He picked it up. It was heavy, solid. He peeled back the paper, then the foil. An intoxicating smell hit him. Sweet, bitter, rich. Nothing like the subtle scents of Japan. This was a scent of power, of industry, of a world he could not comprehend. He broke off a small square. The snap was clean, sharp. He placed it on his tongue. It began to melt instantly. A wave of overwhelming, complex flavor flooded his senses. Sweetness, yes, but also a deep, dark richness that coated his mouth. It was not food. It was an event. He did not die that day, or the next. The food kept coming, the milk, the bread, the chocolate. Always the chocolate. It appeared after dinner, a silent offering, a sacrament of a strange new religion. Tanaka and the others, Abe, Saito, Endo, they whispered about it in the barracks at night. They had been told America was decadent, weak, its people soft. But this was not weakness. This was a different kind of strength. A nation that could afford to give its enemies such luxuries was not a nation on the verge of collapse. It was a nation of unimaginable, terrifying abundance. The propaganda posters Hideo Watanabe had drawn in Tokyo, the demonic GIs with fangs and claws, they dissolved like sugar on the tongue, replaced by the face of Private Miller, who sometimes slipped them an extra bar. The folder in the Office of War Information was labeled Project Mana. It contained translated letters from Japanese prisoners in camps across America. From Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. From Angel Island, California. From the cornfields of Iowa. A letter from a Sub-Lieutenant Isoroku Abe, dated December 9th, 1944, was flagged with a red tab. They do not treat us as vanquished foes, he wrote to a contact in Switzerland. They treat us as misplaced children. We work on their farms. The land is endless. The machines do the work of 100 men. At night, they give us chocolate. I have come to understand that we are not fighting a nation of soldiers. We are fighting a nation of factories. The factories were the true enemy, not the men. A report from an interrogator at Hancock County noted a change. A profound change. The prisoners were no longer defiant. They were curious. They asked questions about wages, about farms, about the cars they saw driving on the paved roads beyond the wire. They asked how much a bar of chocolate cost. When told a nickel, they fell silent. A nickel. For something so luxurious, the economic reality was more devastating than any bomb. It shattered the very foundation of their emperor-centric world. The Yamato spirit could not compete with a 5-cent Hershey's bar. It simply could not. In a declassified box of personal effects, a sketchbook was found. It belonged to Kenji Tanaka. It was not filled with images of war, not with glorious Banzai charges or sinking American ships. Page after page showed sketches of the Iowa landscape, a tractor, a silo against a vast sky, and on one page a simple, delicate drawing. A man's hand, thin and calloused, holding a half-eaten bar of chocolate. The man's face is not visible, only the hand and the object of its focus. The caption, written in neat katakana, was just one word. Peace. This was not the peace of surrender. It was the peace of a full stomach, the peace of a future that suddenly seemed possible, a future with chocolate. The war was won on the beaches of Normandy and the volcanic sands of Iwo Jima, with bullets, with ships, with fire. That is the story we are told. But perhaps that is only half the story. The other half is quieter. It unfolded in mess halls and barracks, far from the front lines. It was a war of perception, a battle for the soul fought with white bread and cold milk. The narratives of Imperial Japan, crafted with such care in the paper-scented offices of Tokyo, were formidable. They were built on honor, on sacrifice, on the divine myth of an entire people. They were strong, but they were not strong enough. They could not withstand the simple, undeniable truth of a piece of chocolate. It acted as a bridge, a small, sweet bridge across a chasm of hatred and propaganda. In that single taste, a Japanese soldier could experience a reality completely alien to the one he had been promised. He could taste abundance. He could taste a different way of life, a different definition of power. These were not demons, these Americans. They were people who could turn sugar, milk, and cacao beans into a weapon more insidious and effective than any torpedo. A weapon that didn't destroy the body, but instead captured the mind. The story of the Pacific War is a story of great battles and terrible loss, but it is also the story of these small human moments. A reminder that sometimes the most profound understanding between enemies is not found in a treaty. It is found in a shared, simple pleasure. It began with the taste of a future they never knew they wanted, a future that tasted an awful lot like chocolate. How does a war truly end? Not with the ink of a signature on the deck of a battleship, not with the formal surrender of a nation's government. For the men who had sworn to die on that final, desolate rock in the Pacific, the war ended in a way no treaty could ever legislate. It ended with a taste. The story was never about the food itself. It was about the fear. The paralyzing, absolute fear of a simple can of peaches, seen not as sustenance but as the final, dishonorable poison from a deceitful enemy. The records speak of this. They speak of the machine gun nests still hot. They speak of the grim resolve of men who had witnessed the unspeakable, who knew of medical experiments in bodies dissolved by lime. They were men prepared for a bayonet charge. They were prepared for a grenade in a foxhole. They were not prepared for a gesture of peace. They refused it with a terrifying, silent resolve. Then came the chocolate. Sergeant Kenji Tanaka, formerly of the Imperial Japanese Navy, watched the guard. He saw the tray. He saw the small, dark square that was not in any military manual. This was the true unknown. More terrifying than a bomber overhead. More alien than the language of his captors. The truth was not in the battle reports. The truth was in that moment of hesitation, a pause that stretched between two worlds. It was more than cocoa and sugar. It was an offering that defied the logic of total war. It was a crack in the ideological armor, an admission of a shared world beyond the kill zone. They came as warriors, divine wind, ready to sacrifice their bodies for an emperor. They were confronted not with death, but with a simple human pleasure. A pleasure that asked nothing of them. A pleasure that did not demand their lives, but affirmed them. The official histories will never capture it. That silent, seismic shift. The narrative lies scattered, between redacted prisoner interrogation files, between the lines of a forgotten soldier's unsent letter, between the silence of men who returned home with a secret they could never explain. They had been trained to die. They were never trained to live. What happened to Kenji Tanaka? Did that single taste dismantle a lifetime of duty, of sacrifice, of emperor worship? Did he see in that small sweetness a world he had been forbidden to imagine? The archives offer no answers. They only deepen the mystery, leaving behind the ghost of a question. Perhaps the greatest weapon in any conflict is not the one that takes a life, but the one that unexpectedly gives a piece of one back. The war for the island was over, but in that moment, for Sergeant Tanaka and the men who followed his lead, a new, entirely private war had just begun. A war fought not with rifles, but with a memory. The sweet, bitter, and utterly human memory of chocolate.